and welcome to the program. My name is Luke Hunt, and this is a podcast recorded on behalf of Bombora Media Productions. And with me today is James Fountain. James is a poet, an author, and has done an enormous amount of work with a new book coming out on Joseph Macleod, who was very famous in his day, radio broadcaster and poet. James, welcome to the program.
Welcome.
Background me. Tell me a lot more about Joseph Macleod. He seems like a fascinating character, and I guess his initial fame came out of World War II when he was a BBC broadcaster.
Yeah, you could say that. He was famous for another thing, which was 1930. He published the Ecliptic, which was pushed upon T.S. Eliot by Ezra Pound to be published. But after that, there was a big gap until the Second World War began, and his second book came out in 1940. His work really was then written under a pseudonym called Adam Drynan, and he wrote then sort of Highlands poetry, Scottish Highlands poetry about the problems in the Highlands, such as the clearances and so on that were caused by the injustice, I guess, of the British colonialists that kicked them out, basically, the landlords, the lairds as they called them. And he wrote 5 books, during the Second World War that were centred around that topic. So the Highland clearances and the history of the Highlands, but also incorporating Scottish Gaelic into that. So the sound of Scottish Gaelic into standard English, which is, I think he's the only person that's ever done that. But yeah, he was famous mostly for being not a poet, but for being a BBC newsreader during the Second World War. So he was there from the whole length of the Second World War, from 1938 up to 1945, after having given a talk about Stalin on Soviet theatre. Basically, he did a lot about Soviet theatre and Stalin's the good of Stalin for having promoted Soviet theatre. But of course, then Stalin then changed and more or less stabbed all the British literati in the back by behaving the way he did,
Right. Now, where does your fascination with Macleod begin? And I have to point out, you're a lot more than a fan. I mean, your PhD is on Macleod. You have a book coming out with Waterloo Press, correct me if I'm wrong. And where did the inspiration come from to follow up on Macleod and what he did?
Well, basically, it's not... The beginning part of it wasn't really to do with me. It was the first book that came out about Macleod was 2009. That's after obviously a long gap of maybe 40 years of nothing coming out about him at all. And that was Andrew Duncan's selected poems. So he selected out, if you like, the best of Joseph Macleod, what he saw as the most relevant sections of his work for Waterloo Press. And then basically in 2012, we collaborated on a book together. That was after I'd completed the PhD, which was the first ever PhD on him. But at the same time, Macleod's, it was really sort of the quality of his work that I liked. It was unusual. It had a point to it. It's not just rambling poetry about nothing. It's poetry about the justice, the injustice, should I say, of the English towards the Scots during the clearance period, so the 1750s, especially, and he sort of seems to stand up for justice, and his poetry always it sort of advocates for equality, for anti-tribalism, and for goodness, really. He sort of stands up for good, and that's what I liked about his work,
Was he a part of the British establishment? In your
absolutely not.
Where his voice was once voted the most recognisable in the United Kingdom, even more so than Churchill, according to Radio Times readership.
Yeah, sure, but he was not. He was pretty anti-establishment, I would say. He did things that were kind of quite weird at the time, like he was quite eccentric. So he'd wear his Macleod kilt, his Macleod clan kilt, to go to work at the BBC when they didn't really approve of that at all. wasn't a fan of Churchill at all. His book, A Job at the BBC, shows that he was very anti-Churchillian. He thought he was a pompous old man, really. There's a moment where Churchill puts his cigar out on his desk. So he obviously didn't think much of that either. But I think Churchill knew damn well what he was, so that's why he put his cigar out on his desk.
Right.
And smoked downstairs in the basement when nobody from the BBC is allowed to smoke downstairs in the basement for health and safety reasons.
This is back in the 1940s.
During the war. Yeah. So it's I think he knew what Churchill was from his point of view anyway. Without getting too political, he wasn't a communist, but he was certainly a socialist, and he never joined the Communist Party. But then again, he had interest in Stalin, early Stalin, I should say. Obviously not Stalin, the murderer, the mass murderer. He was much more interested in Stalin.
But he was our friend, and the Germans were advancing.
Well, it's more like the sort of the art side of it. You know, the poets at the time, like Auden, Macleod, McNeice, all these key poets at the time, they all loved Stalin, you know, at the very beginning. And then, of course, they quickly changed their tune when he started, like, slaughtering people, and, you know. So that's the thing. There was a time when Stalin was loved by the English literati, the British literati as a whole. But then, of course, they realised it was all a big, terrible mistake, and you got the Spanish Civil War, then you've got the Second World War, and of course, the people's perception of him completely changed. So, but Macleod's, he never belonged to any one group. He certainly wasn't pro-British establishment.
There was an uneasy alliance in that George Orwell, for instance, was famously at the other end of the political spectrum to Churchill, but they understood each other.
Yeah.
They kind of they saw the extremities on both sides of politics, left and right, as not being conducive to a healthy society, and this was being borne out more and more, I guess, during World War II.
Mm-hmm. I agree. The only thing I would say, though, about that is that Orwell and Macleod, they never ever met. Macleod is on Orwell's list of 37 crypto-communists that he developed. I think that was in 1948, just before he died, when he was extremely paranoid because he'd developed tuberculosis, I think it was it?
He carried a gun.
And he carried a gun, and he just finished writing 1984, and he was terrified of, I don't know, he was just generally very paranoid, and he'd written, obviously, Charlie Chaplin's name on this list, and Michael Redgrave, all these people who were, they were communists, but they were no real threat to anybody.
Well, how do you mean by crypto-communists?
So this is people who were seen to be possibly infiltrating the British psyche at the time, it was seen by MI6 as a big problem, and the CIA as well.
They had issues at the time.
Yeah.
Or emerging issues, I guess, with Philbies and
yes,
that's the espionage networks that the Russians had established in Britain.
So you see, like Graham Greene was possibly going to be part of that. I could talk about him in a second because he knew Macleod, but Greene, interestingly, was never on that list, and that's because Greene made it quite clear in his own writing that he wasn't a communist, that he's pro-Catholic.
He was pro-Catholic, and it would emerge much later on that he was SIS, Secret Intelligence Services.
That's right, and worked for CIA and MI6 quite extensively, and apparently a little bit with KGB. Macleod is different to that. He wasn't part of any of these groups. He wasn't a journalist as such. He actually just read the news. That was it. That was his job. He was in those days they picked out actors to be newsreaders, and he was an actor and director in another life between 1930 and 1930 and 1938 for the Cambridge Festival Theatre. And he basically he was a very good actor. He was known to have a fantastic voice, which is what the Radio Times
they
mentioned.
used to call it rip and read, which was where the newsreader would come out, tear off the top three paragraphs from that was coming through over the telex machines, sit down and read the news.
This is it, and he did do one program though that was repeated 3 times. Mm-hmm. That was about Soviet theatre history, which is might seem a bit incongruous to your listeners, because you might think, well, 1938, it's the start of the Second World War. Why would Soviet theatre be of interest to the British public? But it was, because it was at the time, you had sort of the top dramatists really at the time were Russian, and like Chekhov, for example, and it was really exciting, all the stuff that was coming through, the ballet, and this highly stylized kind of theatre. It merged into sort of the movies at the time as well, So
right, going from radio to television, pictures.
Yeah, theatre too.
Days, television was considered of a higher quality simply because they were hiring radio broadcasters who understood the word. Yeah,
this is it. And so Macleod's like shining a light for them on this, but also they just really liked his voice. And then the BBC came up with the idea of, we'll have him read the news then. But he certainly wasn't popular there. He got suspended 3 times while he was at the BBC. Each time for, I think it was 6 months at a time. So it's 1.5 of those 8 years he wasn't actually working. He was sent to far-flung parts of the country to do stupid research. As like a punishment for...
Sorry, Alan Partridge kind of comes to mind.
Yeah. And that's it. So he got payback for like not being really part of the boys' club. He just did, because he wasn't one of the lads. And he refused to play ball. He often got paid back for that. But he was very stubborn, and he didn't want any. He didn't want any connection with groups. He didn't want to be part of the Auden group, for example. They call it McSpondy. I can't remember what it's called now. McSpender Spondy group. So that's the group that contained like Stephen Spender, McNeice and Auden, so those 3 key poets. Macleod refused to be part of that, even though he went to university at the same time as Auden did, even though his first book was published at the same time as Auden. He didn't ever want to be part of that sort of group, and he did write documentary verse, which is what his Scottish poetry is. That's what we call documentary verse. And he developed that, and that's something to do with the Soviet theatre and so on. He wrote 3 books about Soviet theatre history during the Second World War, one of which was reviewed on the front page of the TLS in 1943.
TLS being?
The Times Literary Supplement, sorry. So he was just as famous for being a theatre historian as he was for being a poet, but by far the most famous for being the guy that read the news during... He mostly read Defeat Report.
Going back to your analogy of poets, back in the day, and Macleod aside, were a lot of these great poets truly great, or were they simply a member, as you pointed out, of the appropriate boys' club?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, obviously, in my opinion, McNeice and Auden are, they're both hugely influential now on today's writers. They wrote what we would now describe as great poetry. Macleod also did write great poetry. His poetry is not just that.
You're saying that Macleod wasn't in the boys' club, but yet his poetry is considered great.
Oh,
I'm wondering if these other poets would still be considered great if they were not in the boys' club, if they stood out as individuals and had causes that they believed in which were considered inappropriate at the time.
You could argue that Auden's fame came from, and then by association with that, McNeice and Spender a little bit, and Spender to a lesser extent. He seems to be disappearing. But you could argue that their fame is partially due to American, moving to America and reading in America. So, for example, Auden and Dylan Thomas, who were, massive in the 50s, 40s, one of the reasons that they became big was because they went to America, and they stood and spoke to these huge American audiences in New York City and other places, and they were seen as quintessential British men, Right. So, and of course, they have the drunken, sort of boorish kind of like lout, which is Dylan Thomas, and yet he had this beautiful turn of phrase, and he was a magnificent orator. And then you had Auden, who had the very cut glass English accent, and
a lovely turn of phrase.
Yeah, as the quintessential British gentleman, you know, so they were just massively important in America. The Americans loved their poetry. Other editors, actually, American editors, got sick of their poetry, and there's some editorials that show that they don't really buy into that group. They don't see the relevance of it, and preferred Macleod's writing. So I think it's one of those things. Macleod never became populist, but that to me makes him, as somebody who prefers indie type things anyway and lesser known things, to me that makes Macleod more interesting, because he didn't blow his own trumpet in any way. He was very committed when he worked at the BBC, although misunderstood sometimes, and sidelined slightly because of his Scottish accent.
That really mattered back then? I mean, it's obviously changed with the Beeb. These days you have to have an accent that's difficult to understand to get on, but I remember around the English-speaking world, the job of newsreaders was to mimic that BBC, the plum.
Well, he was suspended one time for having mispronounced, as the BBC put it, the word destroyer. So he's sort of, I think it's something along the lines of destroyer, like a, you know. So that's like a sort of Glaswegian way of doing it, and it's just kind of, he said it was just by mistake. It wasn't on purpose or anything.
Right. But I remember being in trouble with the Americans on we dropped hours on pulling together a production because I'd pronounced Adidas and not Adidas.
Oh, dreadful. But it's because his parents are both. His father was, a very important man for Rio Tinto. He was the general secretary of Rio Tinto. He earned millions of pounds a year, and he lived in a huge, big, massive estate in Scotland. And his mother, he was from the Scottish Highlands, and his mother was from the Scottish Highlands also. And they spent a lot of time in Scotland. So when he was a child, yes, he was born in Ealing in London. Yes, he went to a British public school in rugby school, as you know. No, that's what the done deal was for upper class people, to be shot into these schools. But he did have a Scottish accent sometimes, and wasn't constant. He was normally it sounded pretty cut glass, the same as Auden's. But occasionally he would, as the BBC call it, mispronounce a word, which is kind of like racist, really.
Not about racist, but certainly old school prejudices.
Yeah.
That,
tribalist, at least, I would say. And then, but yeah, this is the sort of thing that got Macleod's goat, and I think that's why he wrote these books about the Highland clearances and stuff like that. It was sort of to get some of that out of his system.
Right. Graham Greene. I've always had like many people, I've had a particular fascination with Greene, in particular his family, and much of my interest comes out of Southeast Asia. And when he was reporting as a journalist, the 1950s, I think into the 60s as well, but he was in Vietnam at an extraordinary time. What was his relationship with Macleod?
Yeah, so Macleod met him at Balliol College, Oxford, when he was 18. They both started at the same time, 1922. So this would be just the period where Greene's just coming out of that Russian roulette period, where he spent most of his time when he was 17 to 18 years of age, playing Russian roulette with this gun that he'd found. Well, Macleod wrote poetry that Graham Greene would edit and include in his editorial, basically, for the Oxford Outlook. So Graham Greene was, when he was 19 years of age in 1923 up to about 1925, he edited the journal, the Oxford Outlook, and it's no longer still going, but it was very important at the time because it would include stories from people like Evelyn Waugh and poems by Auden and people like that people that went on to become, like, if you like, all-time greats.
Great names in there. Scoop is one of my favourite books of all time, as it should be.
Of course, yeah, and then Brideshead and all the rest of it, and of course Brideshead does include I'm not sure Macleod's included in that. Brideshead Revisited by War, but certainly a lot of his friends were in there. Sebastian, who's probably the most famous character in there, the sort of gay, tragic suicide. He was part of their circle. They all knew each other very well. So that whole period was very important to all of them, really. Yeah, they were just really good friends. I mean, they spent a lot of time together talking to each other, and Green included actually more work by Macleod than any other person. So I think that says a lot about what he thought about his work.
There's a relationship that they maintained throughout their lives.
Yes, and so he included, I think, 10 short stories by Green. Green included 10 short stories by Macleod, and he also included about 10 poems. And then after they left, they continued to correspond like all their life, basically. They didn't really cross paths anymore because Green and Macleod were far too busy. They were both extremely busy people all their lives, really. Mm-hmm. But Green especially was always, bombing around the world, wasn't he, doing his different things that he was doing. But he did send some really interesting items of correspondence to Macleod, such as like when I think he was about 70, he hears of something going on in like Buenos Aires, and he describes what he did, what he was like as a person. So he went straight to the airport, got a first class ticket from Heathrow to Buenos Aires, and then we checked into the hotel, went to this coffee shop, witnessed a murder on the streets, saw an archbishop excommunicated on the streets, from his bedroom window.
Right. Welcome to the Badlands.
This is it. And so Graham Greene obviously knew, his contacts were so good that he knew all about these kind of things, but he'd confide these stories in Macleod. So he would tell Macleod all about what he was doing. And yeah, they continued to be really good friends, And he included a poem about Greene in his last collection, An Old Olive Tree, which is 1971, I believe. Mm-hmm. It's called A Dream of Envy. Which is interesting because I think Macleod was sort of envied his fame because Macleod didn't like to self-publicise, but I think towards the end he would have liked to have been more famous. But then I think one of the lines is to know that you are miserable and famous. So yeah.
That's what I was going to ask you. What are your favourite Macleod lines? Can you recite any off the top of?
Sure. Well, this is like a short poem by Macleod, so I think it's probably the best I can do. And this is sort of to do with identity and how he sees himself, I guess. And it's called Riddle Me Ree. This is 1971. I was afraid and they gave me guts. I was alone and they made me love. Round that wild heat they built a furnace, and in the torment smelted me. Out of my fragments came design. I was assembled, I moved, I worked, I grew receptive. Thanks to them, I have fashioned me. Who am I? So I think that poem basically plugs into this whole idea of him, how he sees himself and how he doesn't really see himself at the same time. I don't think he knows how the British public saw him because he left the UK when he was 19 in 1955 to live in Italy. He was totally unplugged from the poetry network, if you like, by that point. So yeah, this is partially why Macleod became obscure, because he didn't maintain his own legacy, if you like. So yeah.
The eternal questions and the meaning of life. People tend to look to the poets in finding these answers. Did they get any closer than the rest of us?
I think Macleod does, and there's if you read Macleod, there's a lot there. The Ecliptic is very much a misunderstood poem. It's 77 pages long. It's about 2,700 lines. Yeah, it's a book, and he only wrote books. He didn't write short poems really. That was an exception. That one. He mostly wrote book length poems, if you like. So he thought that, for example, Milton and those sorts of people, Byron. Like John Juan, and then you've got the Milton's Paradise Lost. Those sorts of poems were where the real meat was. So, in other words, the longer the poem, the more meaning you get, basically. And a lot of his poetry understands a lot about the world, you know. So I would say, yeah, he does. People like him that wrote longer poems do understand a lot. Shorter poems often don't go deep enough, maybe, although they can do, of course. But yeah, unlike Auden wrote short, sharp poems a lot of the time, apart from the odd one like Spain, which is 3 or 4 pages long.
Mm-hmm. Now, your book, Hidden Sun, The Poetry of Joseph Macleod, published by Waterloo Press, it's part of your PhD. Tell us a little, the book, when is it due out? How do we get it?
Well, the book itself is the PhD edited down to book length, and it's also made more readable. I guess that's the whole point of it. But yeah, no, it's available to buy now. You can buy it at waterloopress.co.uk. It's £20 basically.
How long did it take you to accumulate, sit down, and write?
I started at 17. Well, I started the PhD 17 years ago, so it's a 17-year project, I guess. To get it all into a book, it took ages. But I'd say about 4 or 5 years in total.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, definitely. But it was worth. I thought it was worth doing because Macleod is worth knowing about, and his legacy is worth knowing. I mean, he didn't obviously protect his own legacy in his own lifetime. He tried to. He put all his paperwork in the National Library of Scotland. Everything's there, basically.
You had to go through the archives and pull out the original notes, the original...
Yeah. Diaries, letters, correspondence. Yeah, there's 10,000 pieces of correspondence there, and I went through all of them. But it's worth reading, you know. It's worth other people having a look. I mean, like, there's letters from Laurence Olivier there.
What was in the letters?
Well, Laurence Olivier, for example, he's talking about his acting. He's talking about his acting. He's talking about how he's directing as well. But he's thanking Macleod for including him in a production for the Cambridge Festival Theatre when Macleod was there. There's a lot of stuff from very, very famous writers like Compton Mackenzie, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams is more famous in the US, but he's a super important poet. So there's a lot of stuff there that's great interest that nobody's actually read before, apart from me. So I think partially his book hopefully promotes how Macleod's work is worth looking at. Again, you know, it's worth like people reading all of it. It's worth people trying to get to know him.
It's certainly worth compiling his work, putting it in a book, having it published, and students at Cambridge and elsewhere be able to access that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Oxford University. Yeah, Oxford University, I gave a talk there recently, and at Balliol, which is where Macleod was. That was quite interesting, being in a room where he actually was before, and where Green was before, and, you know, walking through these towers. Very interesting. But yeah, there's postgraduate students there that will definitely be including Macleod in their studies. I don't know to what extent, but I was told by the head of department there that there's a guy called Seamus Perry, Professor Seamus Perry, that he was an item of great interest, you know, sort of.
Of course he was. Yeah. Sounds like an extraordinary figure from the 20th century.
But nobody knew him before. This is the thing. So this book's basically promoting.
And he was forgotten.
He was forgotten. Yeah, basically. And it's a long time. For a long time though. I mean, I don't think he was known in this country much at all beyond the 50s, I would say. So it's like he's been buried for about 70 odd years, and like I said, that's partially to do with himself. That's his. That's definitely his thing. You know, he didn't really care enough about his own legacy, but I like that about him. That shows that he was played down and not self-promoting, but obviously that's not much good for a poet. You need to be self-promoting if you want to be a famous poet.
Well, that's these days. But on that note, James Fountain, thank you very much. Good luck with the book. A critical piece of research from the 20th century that needs to be put back up on the shelves.
It's very kind of you to have me. Thank you very much. Thanks.
All the best. Thanks,
Cheers.
James.
Cheers.